Chapter 1. Beginnings in Indiana, in the still, gray hush of 1950s Indianapolis, where sidewalks were clean, voices were low, and change arrived only on tiptoe. Strange new voice began to echo through a modest church basement. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was something slower, warmer. It promised food instead of fire, safety instead of salvation, and it belonged to a young preacher named Jim Jones. Before we settle into this quietly remarkable story, tell us, from which country are you watching tonight? Share your thoughts in the comments. We love seeing where sleepy history travels. And if you enjoy gently told stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe for more long, calm dives into the forgotten corners of the past. In those early days, Jones didn't look like someone destined to lead a movement or to become one of the most controversial religious figures in American history. He wore cheap suits and used second-hand pulpits, but what he lacked in polish, he made up for in persistence. His sermons delivered in the Community Unity Church, soon renamed the People's Temples, spoke to people who weren't used to being heard. He offered bags of groceries with scripture. He preached about racial equality in a city still drawn in strict black and white lines. He brought in strangers, sat beside them, fed them, and called them family. His services were small at first, but word traveled, not because of miracles or theatrics, but because he showed up in living rooms, on porches, at hospital bedsides, wherever someone was hungry or lonely. Jones found his way there. He believed the church shouldn't just talk about love, it should hand it out in brown paper bags. And for many, especially African Americans and the working poor, this was something new. Not just preaching, practical kindness. The pews began to fill. It's worth remembering that Indianapolis in the 1950s was a city still deeply segregated. Most churches were racially divided, but Jones insisted on something different. His congregation was multiracial. From the start, he adopted children of different races, including a black child, becoming the first white family in Indiana to do so. His household was soon known as the Rainbow Family. His message was unusual, a blend of Pentecostal energy, Christian compassion, and socialist ideas. He encouraged members to live communally, to share resources, and to see themselves as part of a larger human family. He also began wearing sunglasses, inside at first, just occasionally, later, always. In these early years, the People's Temple was not glamorous. The church smelled of old hymnals and instant coffee. Folding chairs squeaked against the linoleum. Potlucks were built around mashed potatoes and casseroles. And yet, something rare was forming. Community. The sermons were long but full of purpose. There were no spotlights or stained glass, just Jones, talking about the value of giving and staying and showing up for one another. It was a church for people who had nowhere else to go. Widows, single mothers, veterans, the elderly, the poor. He gave them something the city often didn't: belonging. He used small things like free soup and hugs and second-hand shoes to build big loyalty. But soon, cracks began to show. Jones wanted more than faith. He wanted control. Services became longer. Private counseling sessions began to resemble interrogations. He asked members to confess sins publicly and pledge their full allegiance to the church. He started talking about the outside world as a capitalist, corrupt. Inside the temple, Everything was love. Outside, it was danger, and many believed him. Because inside, there was food, and music, and shared chores, and late-night laughter. And if he staged a healing here or there, who cared? If you were sick, and he said you were better, sometimes, strangely, you felt better. Jones was a master of emotional suggestion. People said he knew things no one told him, that he could predict the future, that he was touched by God. He never denied it, but he also never quite said it out loud. In 1961, he forced a white hospital to treat a black patient. He literally refused to leave the man's side until they agreed. They did. Jones left with a quiet smile. These stories spread. He was no longer just a preacher, he was a civil rights hero, at least to some. But he was also becoming paranoid. He feared nuclear war and American collapse. He started looking for a way out, a safe place, somewhere far from missiles and politicians. And in quiet hours between the sermons and soup lines, he began making plans to leave America, but not yet. Indiana still had work to do. People still needed help. The congregation was growing. Members were offering up their homes, their paychecks, even their pensions to the cause. He told them the money wasn't his, it was theirs, for the mission, for justice, and in return, he gave them something even harder to find than food. He made them feel necessary, that they weren't just saved, they were part of something bigger, a revolution, hidden inside a potluck. Then, in 1965, Jones abruptly relocated many of his most loyal followers to California. He said the coasts were safer, that Indianapolis had played its part. Some went willingly, others hesitated, and a few stayed behind. Quietly, those who left would find that California was not the end of the journey. It was merely the next phase, a bigger congregation, a brighter spotlight, and eventually a plan that would take them far beyond American borders. But the ones who remembered Indiana would always speak of it the same way. The place where it all felt honest, where it was still just a preacher, a pot of beans, and a borrowed pulpit, where belief still fit inside a church basement. And so our chapter closes on a sleepy corner of 1950s Indiana, where one man quietly learned how to build a following not with fire and fear, but with rice, hugs, and shared hymns. But the question lingers. What did Jim Jones discover when he took the temple west toward the sunlit fields of California? Chapter 2. Life at People's Temple, California, in the late 1960s, shimmered with idealism. Hippies in San Francisco wore flowers in their hair. Activists marched in Berkeley. The air smelled faintly of incense, exhaust fumes, and revolution. If Indiana had been the seedbed for Jim Jones's ideas, California was the warm, sunlit soil where they could grow wild. When the People's Temple arrived, it brought casseroles and charisma, but it quickly evolved into something more complex, more organized, and harder to walk away from. Before we go deeper, let us know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country in the comments. It makes our sleepy little history community feel even closer. And if you find these calm chapters comforting, be sure to subscribe and join us for more quietly told stories. Now, back to the Golden State. In Ukiah, a quiet, forest-fringed town in Northern California, the temple purchased a large property surrounded by redwoods and gravel roads. They called it the Redwood Valley Temple. It was meant to be a haven from nuclear war, a rural retreat, far from the bombs Jones feared. Here, families could live communally, work in the gardens, attend classes, and listen to sermons. The temple's growth strategy was methodical. They held free meals, healing services, and job placement programs. They appealed to the poor, the elderly, and idealistic college students disillusioned by Vietnam, racism, and inequality. Jones's message still echoed what it had in Indiana. We take care of each other because no one else will, but California brought something new: visibility. Jones realized that success in the Bay Area meant playing the public game. He moved the church's operations closer to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where the congregations swelled to the thousands. The temple now owned apartment buildings, small businesses, and multiple buses used for shuttling members to rallies and Sunday services. He encouraged members to give up their possessions and live communally. Temple nurses cared for the sick. Temple teachers homeschooled children. Temple mechanics repaired cars. Nearly everything was handled internally. Life became efficient. There were work shifts, meeting schedules, early morning cleanup crews, and shared meals, often beans, rice, and bread. The community pooled its income into a central account. Those who didn't live on temple property often gave 25% or more of their paycheck. It was called revolutionary sacrifice. Sundays were intense. Church services sometimes lasted 6 or 8 hours. Attendees were bussed in from across the state. They were greeted with hugs, singing, and stacks of pancakes. Jones often began with traditional sermons, then slowly moved into more political messaging: capitalism, warning of fascism, predicting nuclear war, and offering the temple as the only safe refuge. Occasionally, Jones would reveal hidden knowledge about someone in the crowd, information they hadn't shared. He claimed it was divine insight. In reality, his inner circle collected details through confidential interviews, letters, and gossip. Still, it worked. People gasped, they cried, they believed. He held healing sessions, removing cancerous growth, usually animal organs, hidden in a paper towel. Again, the illusion wasn't the point. The loyalty was. One woman remembered, "He gave us something to believe in, something real." It wasn't perfect, but it was more than we had before. That was the line for many. The temple's members were not brainwashed caricatures. They were people, often kind, idealistic, and tired of a country that hadn't treated them well. Many were black seniors who had lived through segregation. Some were disabled. Others were war veterans. They weren't seeking madness. They were seeking safety, and Jones gave it to them. The temple also became politically useful. During San Francisco's housing and poverty crises, Jones could mobilize hundreds of volunteers overnight. He helped elect George Moscone as mayor, and was even appointed to the city's Housing Authority Commission. Politicians liked Jones's ability to organize. His buses full of voters could swing an election. Behind the scenes, things were less rosy. People were overworked. Some were punished for minor rule violations, public scoldings, sleep deprivation, even mock beatings during church discipline sessions. Families were split into dorms. Parents were encouraged to let others raise their children for the cause. Jones started controlling romantic relationships and marriages. Members couldn't always choose whom they dated. Loyalty to him was the highest virtue. He also began broadcasting sermons late at night over a speaker system inside temple properties. while members were trying to sleep. His voice never stopped. He claimed that CIA agents were watching them, that defectors would be hunted down, that enemies lurked everywhere. This paranoia kept his inner circle loyal and everyone else slightly afraid to question. And yet, the good persisted. The temple provided free food for thousands. It housed the homeless. It cared for orphans. In an era when churches often turned their backs on the most vulnerable, the People's Temple stood in the gap. It just happened to be run by a man growing more unwell by the day. By the mid-1970s, journalists began sniffing around. Former members told of mind games, fake miracles, and Jones's inappropriate behavior with women and men alike. Parents reported that their children had been taken. Jones declared the press was attacking them because they were too successful. His solution: leave the country. He told the congregation it was time to build a socialist utopia, free from racism, capitalism, and American surveillance. He'd already sent scouts to Guyana, a small country in South America, bordered by Venezuela, and Brazil. It was English-speaking. The land was cheap, and it was hot a deal for growing crops. He called the new home Jonestown. He promised food forests, harmony, peace, and rest. The land of milk and honey, without police, prisons, or prejudice, just hard work and family. And so, the temple began packing not just bags and tools, but shipping containers filled with equipment, typewriters, water tanks, medical supplies, and books, by the dozens, and then the hundreds. Followers boarded planes and set off for a rainforest clearing in a place they couldn't find on most maps. Many believed this would be the final chapter, that they'd finally live in peace, away from reporters, away from politicians, away from the world that never quite welcomed them. But peace, as it turned out, was harder to grow in the jungle than anyone expected. And so this chapter ends not in tragedy, but in transition, with boxers stacked, bus, engines cooling, and passports stamped with new beginnings. But one question follows them into the jungle. What exactly were they building in Guyana? Could it ever live up to the dream? Chapter 3: Preaching Equality in the dimly lit sanctuaries of the 1960s Midwest, where pews creaked with the weight of quiet segregation and sermons echoed with the absence of justice. Jim Jones found his voice, and it was not soft. It was urgent, impassioned, and increasingly loud. His voice rose above the restrained pulpits of conservative churches and pierced through the apathy of those who had grown numb to racial injustice. At a time when America's wounds were raw from civil rights clashes and racial inequity, Jones preached a different gospel, one that promised total equality, not just in the afterlife, but right here on earth. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. It's always a gift to know where this sleepy little history finds you. And if this quiet journey into the past helps you relax, please consider subscribing more. Forgotten corners of history are on their way. Jones' version of the gospel was radical for its time. Not only did he refuse to segregate the congregants at People's Temple, he actively recruited black members, the poor and the disenfranchised. He opened the church doors wider than most others dared, especially in Indiana, where de facto segregation still shaped public life. In his sermons, he condemned racism, capitalism, and institutional injustice with a kind of theatrical fury. Some came for the healing services, others stayed for the fiery social justice. Too many He wasn't just a preacher, he was a lifeline. He would quote scripture and switch fluidly to Marx or Gandhi, at one moment invoking the wrath of Old Testament prophets, at the next urging collective action and communal care. His theology was a patchwork of the world's great revolutionary ideas, stitched together by charisma and urgency. And for those who felt voiceless black families navigating discrimination, elderly pensioners drowning in bills, single mothers abandoned by the system, Jones offered belonging. He didn't just preach equality, he tried to enforce it. The People's Temple wasn't just a church, it became a kind of early social welfare center. Members could access free food, medical services, counseling, legal help, and childcare. Jones would take the church's resources and pour them directly back into the community. And it worked. Attendance grew. Black and white families sat side by side. The elderly came for dignity. The young came for purpose. Converts weren't just joining a church, they were enlisting in a movement. This wasn't without controversy. In a deeply segregated America, Jones' interracial vision drew criticism, suspicion, and at times, outright hostility. He welcomed people into the church that other pastors avoided. Some locals whispered that he was trying to incite revolution. Others accused him of being un-American or communist. That label communist was one he both embraced and denied, depending on his audience. Publicly, he defended himself as a progressive Christian. Privately, he studied Mao, admired Castro, and quoted Lenin. What truly bound his followers to him wasn't just his sermons, it was the way he made them feel seen. Jones remembered names, histories, birthdays. He often performed so-called miraculous healings during services, calling out illnesses he claimed to know through divine revelation. Many now say these were staged, carefully planned manipulations, but at the time they felt real. People wept, believing they had been cured. They didn't just find religion, they found power, agency, hope. And for a country in the grip of civil unrest, the People's Temple offered a strange calm. It was a place where races mixed peacefully, where children were raised collectively, where poverty was fought head-on. Jones preached that the outside world was sick with greed and hate, but inside the temple, all were equal. That message was irresistible for those left behind by the American dream. By the late 1960s, Jones' political rhetoric grew sharper. He had begun openly attacking U.S. institutions. He called police departments racist armies. He referred to Christianity as a tool of white supremacy. To him, America wasn't just flawed, was spiritually bankrupt. He encouraged members to see themselves as part of a new, emerging moral order. The People's Temple was the vanguard of that order. Some began to see Jones less as a pastor and more as a prophet. Others compared him to a revolutionary leader. He fed that image carefully. He dressed in dark glasses and wore mouse-tiled jackets. He staged loyalty tests, telling members that the world outside was collapsing, that they would be hunted for their beliefs. Some followers accepted this without question. Others began to quietly worry. There was another layer to Jones' preaching that rarely surfaced in public. The fear. As his authority grew, so did his need for control. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who questioned leadership were called selfish, disloyal, or even mentally unstable. Jones would sometimes humiliate doubters during services, making them confess supposed sins before the congregation. He framed obedience not as servitude, but as proof of spiritual evolution. For the elderly and the poor, he framed it as gratitude. He would say things like, "We fed you when no one else would. We healed you when no one else cared. How dare you question the source of your salvation?" And for many, he had a point. The people's temple was the only place that had offered them real help. Still, cracks began to show. Some longtime members left quietly. A few spoke to the press, warning that Jim Jones was not what he seemed. They described emotional manipulation, fake healings, and increasingly authoritarian control. But to the majority, still inside the temple, these people were traitors. They had abandoned the cause. They had walked away from equality. The movement continued to expand, and Jones' ambitions with it. He was no longer content with one church in Indiana. He saw himself as a national and even global leader for social justice. And so, he began to look beyond the cornfields of the Midwest. America, he would soon decide, was too corrupt, too hostile, too blind to his vision. If his dream of a truly equal society was to survive, it would have to be planted somewhere new. And so the temple began to prepare, not just spiritually, but logistically. Plans were drawn, documents were forged, land was surveyed thousands of miles away. What started in a small Indiana chapel had grown into something far larger, far more complex, and far more dangerous that the gospel of equality had turned into. Something else entirely. A system of absolute devotion. A blueprint for utopia. And for some, though they didn't yet realize it, a death sentence. Chapter 4. Leaving America. The year was 1977, and across the United States, headlines began whispering doubts about the man many once called a prophet, Jim Jones, who had risen from humble beginnings in Indiana to command a flock thousands strong, was now under the slow, grinding spotlight of public scrutiny. Questions were growing louder. Stories began surfacing. Families whispered about lost children. Former members were speaking out. For the People's Temple, the future no longer looked like California. It looked like escape. They left quietly. At first, 1 or 2, then 10, then more. The whispers turned into departures, then a full-blown exodus. They weren't going to Oregon or Texas or even Mexico. They were going to the jungle, to Guyana, small South American country most Americans couldn't find on a map, to a place where no one would question them, a promised land of their own. Jonestown, if you're watching this, let us know in the comments which country you're from. We love seeing how far history reaches. And if you're still awake, consider subscribing. We have many more quiet stories like this one. But how did an American church movement end up deep in the rainforest of a foreign country? It wasn't a random decision, and it didn't happen overnight. Jim Jones had long admired socialist regimes, especially those that claimed to promote equality and anti-colonialism. Guyana, a newly independent nation once ruled by the British, fit the bill. It was English-speaking, agriculturally rich, and far enough from U.S. jurisdiction to offer him comfort. More importantly, it was a place where he could shape his own society without the press, the courts, or the parents of defectors knocking on the gate. Jones' rhetoric began to shift. In temple meetings, he spoke of Guyana as the new place free from racism, capitalism, and the enemies of socialism. California, he warned, was collapsing under the weight of fascism and American imperialism. To survive, the temple would have to flee. And like Moses, he would lead his people away from the modern-day pharaohs. In 1974, the People's Temple had already begun leasing land from the Guyanese government, a remote 3,800-acre plot in the northwest region of the country. By 1977, that land had become their lifeboat. The first settlers, or pioneers, were sent ahead to clear jungle, build structures, and plant crops. It was hard, hot work. Many had never left the U.S. before. They faced unfamiliar insects, dense vegetation, and oppressive humidity. But the reports sent back were always glowing. "It's paradise," they said. "We're building heaven on earth." In truth, the early reports were exaggerated. The soil was poor, the land remote, and the logistical challenges massive. Supplies had to be hauled in over miles of rough terrain. Medical care was minimal. Electricity was limited. But those back in the States didn't hear the struggle. They heard the dream. And so the departures continued. Jones encouraged families to sell everything, homes, furniture, even heirlooms, and donate the proceeds to the temple. Members boarded planes with one-way tickets, carrying little more than hope and obedience. For many, the move was about more than just loyalty to Jones. It was also about fear. The media was closing in. Lawsuits were pending. The IRS was curious. Families were hiring private investigators to retrieve relatives they believed were being held against their will. Going to Guyana wasn't just spiritual. It was practical. It was survival. And for Jones himself, the escape was urgent. That same year, New West magazine published a damning article based on interviews with ex-members and relatives. The allegations included physical abuse, financial manipulation, forced separations of families, and staged healings. It painted Jones as a controlling, paranoid figure, not a prophet, but a cult leader. Rather than face investigation, he left. In August of 1977, Jim Jones fled to Guyana with several close aides. In his absence, the church's leadership back in San Francisco tried to maintain appearances. But soon after, large waves of temple members began making the same trip, bound for Jonestown. It wasn't a fast journey. First, they'd fly to Georgetown, Guyana's capital, then travel by small planes or boats upriver to the commune. Many arrived with the wide-eyed idealism of pilgrims. They were told they'd be part of a socialist utopia, self-sustaining farm community where love, justice, and equality reigned. The reality, however, was stifling. Upon arrival, each person had to surrender their passport and personal belongings. The compound was surrounded by thick jungle, and there was no easy way out. Letters home were monitored. News from the outside world was filtered through Jones and his trusted radio operators. There was no money, no phone, and no freedom of movement. Still, the people worked. They woke early, performed farm duties, attended long lectures, and lived communally. Many still believed. Some had doubts. But what could they do? Where could they go? From the outside, Jonestown seemed like a grand experiment in communal living. From the inside, it was slowly becoming a prison. Despite the challenges, Jones painted a rosy picture to those still in the United States. Through carefully staged videos and photographs, he showed smiling children, lush crops, and dancing crowds. He called Jonestown the purest communist community that ever existed, and more people kept coming. Jones' paranoia deepened. He believed that enemies of the temple would send agents to sabotage their community. He feared American authorities might come to liberate residents against their will. Armed guards were posted at Jonestown's perimeter. Residents were encouraged to report each other for disobedience. Every threat was externalized. Every voice of dissent labeled as treachery. Sleep deprivation became common. So did White Knight's emergency drills, in which Jones claimed they were under attack and had to prepare for mass death. Sometimes, members were told to drink from cups that Jones said contained poison as a test of loyalty. The poison was fake, but the fear was real. These rehearsals would eventually become reality, but not yet. For now, in late 1977 and throughout 1978, Jonestown grew. The population peaked at around 900 residents, mostly African American, mostly poor, and almost all deeply committed. Some were born into the temple. Others joined in moments of crisis, addiction, poverty, discrimination. They found belonging in the temple, and Jones had given them purpose. But underneath the surface, pressure was building. Families back in America were campaigning harder. Lawyers and journalists were digging deeper, and one U.S. Congressman, Ryan, was beginning to pay very close attention in Jonestown. Meanwhile, the isolation tightened. Jones rarely left the microphone. His voice, broadcast on loudspeakers, filled the jungle from morning until late. At night, he ranted against capitalism, praised revolutionary suicide, and read news of world suffering to justify their self-imposed exile. Residents grew thin. The food was sparse. Medical care was dangerously inadequate. But questioning anything became increasingly difficult. And so, in the deep green shadows of the rainforest, Jonestown continued. A society not just removed from America, but removed from reality. A question lingers as this chapter closes. At what point does loyalty become entrapment? And how far must someone go before they realize they can't come back? Chapter 5. Building Jonestown. The jungle is slow to wake, and so was Jonestown. When the first teams arrived in Guyana, they were greeted by a dense thicket of green, not just trees, but a humidity so thick it clung to the skin like wet wool. The sounds were foreign, insects clicking, birds calling, wind passing through thick leaves. There were no roads, no electricity, no running water, just endless land. The kind of land that promises isolation if you work hard enough. That's what Jim Jones had wanted: distance, privacy, control, and the jungle would offer all of that in time. Before we dive further, a small pause. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, whether the US, India, the Philippines, or anywhere else, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments. It helps us bring you better stories, and we'd love to know who you are. And if this slow unraveling of forgotten history helps you drift off peacefully, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the quiet corners of the past, one sleepy chapter at a time. Back in Guyana, what would eventually be called Jonestown began as a mere concept on a map. The site itself was purchased in 1974, a leased plot of about 3,800 acres in the Northwest District, near the Venezuelan border. This part of Guyana was underdeveloped, even by the country's modest standards. A thick rainforest with red clay soil. It had been used previously for logging, but was now mostly abandoned. That made it perfect for the People's Temple, who were looking for something cheap, remote, and unmonitored. At first, the work was slow. There were fewer than 100 temple members on site in those early days. Most of them were older African-American congregants from California, volunteers who had left behind their homes in the U.S. for what they believed would be a utopia built from scratch. Many of them had never even left the city before, let alone attempted to clear jungle with machetes or lay irrigation pipes by hand. Every structure, no matter how small, began with sweat. The team started by cutting back the jungle itself, removing vines, clearing brush, leveling the ground. There were no bulldozers, no real construction crews. Everything was done manually. They built dormitories from local wood, one piece at a time, and learned often through trial and error how to keep termites from devouring the walls. They struggled to build latrines, eventually settling for trench systems until more permanent sanitation could be installed. Work started early each day, sometimes before sunrise. The jungle doesn't lend itself to productivity, it resists it. Tools rusted overnight. Insects bit at every exposed inch of skin. The humidity made lifting even a small log feel like a weightlifting session. But they pressed on. The plan was ambitious. Jones wanted Jonestown to be fully self-sustaining. Food, water, medical care, education, all produced and managed within the compound. A farming operation was established, though the soil turned out to be far less fertile than anticipated. Crops struggled, and the community had to supplement its meals with food shipments from Georgetown, hundreds of miles away over mostly impassable roads. Chickens were raised, goats kept in makeshift pens, and cassava was planted in long rows. Despite the difficulty in processing the root safely, yet for all the challenges, there was pride among many of the residents. They were building something, literally. Young members learned to thatch roofs and dig wells. Children took part in planting and cooking. They painted murals of equality and peace on the building's phrases like, "We love because we are loved," slogans that echoed Jones's sermons. At night, they gathered for meals in the central pavilion, ate rice and beans, and listened to music played on scratchy cassette players. For a moment, Jonestown almost resembled what it claimed to be a peaceful agrarian commune, working toward a new kind of life. Still, there were cracks beneath the surface. The land never yielded enough. The residents were always tired. Jones, who once walked the fields with his followers, began retreating into his cabin more and more. He became reliant on imported goods and began requesting shipments of prescription drugs, especially tranquilizers and amphetamines. Over time, he ordered that loudspeakers be installed throughout the compound. His voice echoed across the jungle day and night, delivering sermons, warnings, or simply reminders of his authority. Security, too, became more rigid. The group known as the Red Brigade began patrolling the borders of Jonestown. Ostensibly, they were there to protect the settlement from outside threats. In reality, they kept people in. Those who voiced discontent were watched. Those who asked too many questions were summoned for private talks with Jones, often emerging shaken and silent. One woman later recalled that Jonestown began as a dream and slowly turned into a cage. "It wasn't the jungle that scared me," she said. "It was knowing that no one was watching, that we were completely alone." Still, most stayed, because, for many, Jonestown was better than what had come before. Life in America had been filled with racism, poverty, housing insecurity, and limited access to health care. In Jonestown, at least in its first phase, everyone had a roof, food, and a community. And perhaps, even more importantly, they had purpose. They were told they were building something revolutionary, a living, breathing rejection of capitalism, racism, and the American machine that they were. Living out a socialist promise that others had only theorized. That kind of belief can carry people far, even through sweltering jungle heat, even when the beans taste like mildew and the toilets don't flush. As Jonestown grew, new arrivals came by the dozens. They brought with them suitcases and stories, and hope, but also questions. Why so many guards? Why were letters home being read before they were mailed? Why was Jones never seen eating with the others anymore? Why were people afraid to leave? By 1978, the jungle no longer looked wild. The brush had been beaten back, the dormitory stood tall, and the central pavilion gleamed in the midday sun. Jonestown had become a real place, not just an idea on paper, but real places have real consequences. And building a compound is never the same as building trust. As new fences went up, and Jones's voice grew louder on the loudspeakers, one could sense the mood beginning to shift subtly, like a vine tightening around a tree. The question remained, whispered only at night when the generators went quiet. Was this still a sanctuary, or had it already become a trap? Chapter 6: Jungle Routines. The jungle has its own clock. It does not measure time in hours or minutes, but in roars and rustlings, in sweat and sun, in the rising and falling of insect songs. For the residents of Jonestown, this was a new kind of life. A life not defined by the schedules of buses or city noise, but by communal bells, tropical rains, and the ever-present humming pressure of obedience. If you've ever wondered what daily life was like in Jonestown, not the headlines, not the tragedy, but the slow, steady grind of its routines, this chapter will take you there. But before we dive in, if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, let us know your country in the comments. And if you find these slow, quiet journeys through forgotten history relaxing, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue telling these stories, one sleepy chapter at a time. In Jonestown, mornings started early. The community was woken before sunrise by a loudspeaker broadcast, often playing music or messages from Jim Jones himself. Sometimes it was a recording, sometimes it was live. Either way, the sound was inescapable. It echoed through the tree-thick air like a call to prayer, except this wasn't prayer, it was preparation. The day was beginning, and no one was exempt. The first task for many was farming. Crops like cassava, bananas, rice, and okra. For people from California and the Midwest, this climate was brutal. The humidity clung to their clothes. The bugs were relentless. But Jones had promised they would create a paradiser, self-sustaining, socialist utopia where everyone worked for the common good. So they worked. Work wasn't just manual labor, though. Jonestown had its own school, kitchen staff, laundry, service, carpentry team, and medical outpost. Teachers conducted lessons for children, combining basic academics with socialist teachings. Doctors and nurses, some trained and some volunteers, ran the small clinic. Every person had a role, and days were packed with tightly organized tasks, meals, were eaten in a communal pavilion, often rice-heavy, with limited protein. Despite the agricultural work, food supplies were not abundant. Many residents lost weight, their bodies adjusting or suffering from a strict and often insufficient diet. Complaints were discouraged. Gratitude was expected. After lunch came more labor, more meetings, or scheduled classes. But what truly shaped Jonestown wasn't just its routines, it was its surveillance. Jones kept a close watch over everything. Trusted followers, known as the security squad, observed conversations and reported any signs of dissent. Public shaming was a common tool. People who questioned rules were sometimes forced to confess their doubts in front of the entire community. These criticism sessions were emotional spectacles, part punishment, part control. No one was too small to be watched. Even children were taught to report suspicious behavior, sometimes turning in their own parents. The loudspeaker continued all day and into the night. Jones' voice, amplified and inescapable, read the news, delivered sermons, and broadcast warnings about the evils of America. He would speak for hours, his voice sometimes hoarse, sometimes booming, often paranoid. He warned of spies, of assassins, of government plots. He reminded the people that they were being hunted, that they had no choice but to stay. Free time, what little there was, might be spent watching movies if the generator was working, playing music, or writing letters. But most of these letters were monitored, and most were filled with glowing praise for Jonestown, whether sincerely felt or carefully constructed to pass censorship. Some residents did enjoy the routines. Life was predictable, structured, and purpose-driven. Children were surrounded by adults who adored them. Elders were respected. The idea of building something from nothing gave people a kind of pride they had never felt in the U.S. But underneath the discipline and unity, fatigue settled in. People were tired, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and they were isolated. The nearest major town was hours away by boat. Communication with the outside world was filtered. Visitors were rare, escape nearly impossible. Still, the routines continued. Each night, Jones would hold meetings that lasted for hours. Attendance was mandatory. They were called classes or community gatherings, but they were often just platforms for him to speak about socialism, about betrayal, about loyalty. Some nights, he staged loyalty tests. Residents would be asked to drink a liquid, told it was poison, only to be told moments later it was a drill, a test they had passed. These were called white nights. They became more frequent over time. The routines of Jonestown, then, were not just about farming and education. They were about shaping minds, about convincing people, slowly, daily, that they were in danger, that their leader was their only protection, that the world outside had nothing to offer but racism, fascism, and death. These ideas weren't shouted. They were whispered into people's lives through repetition, through structure, through routine. It's difficult to say when ordinary routine became subtle imprisonment. Was it the day they arrived, or did it happen quietly through exhaustion, through repetition, through the slow decay of free will? Maybe it was when Jones replaced the concept of we with I, when his sermons turned from equality to sacrifice, when routines became rituals. Whatever the case, by 1978, Jonestown had become a place of endurance, and the people within it, once hopeful, now cautious, moved through their days with lowered eyes and careful words. There was work, there were meals, there were meetings, but beneath it all, there was silence. The kind that says, don't ask, don't resist, don't leave. As night fell, the jungle grew loud. Frogs, crickets, and distant howls filled the air. But in Jonestown, the only sound was the ever-present voice on the loudspeaker, reminding everyone that sleep, too, was a gift from the movement, that even dreams belonged to the cause. And so the days passed, same as the last, until they didn't. Chapter 7: Rules and Radios. It is easy to imagine the jungle as wild, free, and untamed. But in Jonestown, the trees watched over a very different kind of wilderness. One where order was absolute and silence was often enforced. Life in Jonestown, by mid-1978, was no longer the hopeful experiment it once claimed to be. It had transformed into a quiet machine of regulation, routine, and control. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if this journey through forgotten history helps you sleep. The rules at Jonestown weren't just guidelines. They were law, spiritual code, and moral test all wrapped into one, posted on walls, spoken in meetings, reinforced in whispers and glares. They governed nearly every action: what time to wake up, what to eat, what not to say, what thoughts to think. Jim Jones, often through others, enforced them with growing paranoia. There were mandatory meetings nearly every night, often stretching late into the humid Guyanese darkness. These were called White Nights, a name that sounded peaceful, but rarely was. During these gatherings, residents were expected to share confessions, confess doubts, or offer public praise. Sometimes, people were made to stand and be criticized for perceived mistakes. At other times, they were encouraged to call out others. What made these meetings more oppressive wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the surveillance. Radios, shortwave sets, and intercoms had become the veins of communication in Jonestown. These weren't ordinary tools for music or casual chatter. They were channels for constant control. Jones, who had grown increasingly dependent on medications and rarely appeared in public, would broadcast his voice into homes, dorms, and public spaces. His sermons, rants, and messages played day and night. Sometimes he read the news. Sometimes he raged about the CIA. Other times he simply talked for hours, his voice gravelly and strange, warning of betrayals, praising loyalty, and predicting doom. The radio was never really off. People learned to sleep through it, or at least to pretend to. For many, even the idea of turning down the volume was too risky. Jones insisted he could hear everything. Whether he truly could or not didn't matter. The fear that he might know was enough. Punishments varied. Sometimes it was extra labor under the punishing sun. Other times it was public shaming or isolation. There was a deep ditch called the learning crew, where those who disobeyed were sent for hours of exhausting manual work as penance. For children and teenagers, even minor disobedience could result in solitary confinement in a small box. Privacy, even in thought, began to vanish. Every relationship in Jonestown was affected. Parents were instructed to report on children. Spouses were asked to watch one another. Friends grew wary of closeness. Loyalty to Jones came above all other connections, and his image, oversized, ever-present, loomed over common areas like a shrine. The isolation from the outside world deepened this control. Letters were censored, travel was restricted, guards patrolled the perimeters. And yet, what bound the residents more than the guards or rules was something invisible. The belief that they were part of something noble, revolutionary, and fragile, that they had to protect it from outside forces and from themselves. Still, some doubted. Whispers began to circulate quietly, cautiously, about life in the United States, about family members left behind, about food, freedom, and fear. But those doubts were dangerous. Speaking them out loud could invite punishment or worse, a label of traitor. And being a traitor in Jonestown meant isolation, punishment, or forced loyalty demonstrations. Some still believed deeply, others simply pretended, and many couldn't tell the difference anymore. The radios kept playing. Jones's voice had become part of the landscape, just like the insects, the drumming rain, and the rustle of vines. His nightly broadcasts were strange combinations of prophecy, paranoia, self-praise, and threats. He warned of invasions, of plots, of betrayal among his people. He praised Cuba, cursed the U.S., and claimed that enemies were always listening, and in a way, they were, by this time. The U.S. government had started paying closer attention to the strange commune in the jungle. Letters from concerned relatives, troubling reports, and media pressure were increasing. Congressman Ryan, a representative from California, had taken particular interest. A visit was being planned. Jones knew, so he increased the rules. More drills, more loyalty oaths, more white knights. Radios buzzed louder. Residents were now made to practice for mass death-simulated poisonings, staged emergencies, timed responses. They were told it was a test. They were told that if the U.S. or Guyanese authorities ever came to take them away, they must be ready to die together. And many believed it. What had started as rules to guide a new society had become something more, something darker. The rules were no longer about how to live. They had become, increasingly, about how and when to die. By the end of the summer of 1978, the community was tired. The jungle had not broken them, but the isolation, hunger, and surveillance had worn them thin. Hope had not vanished entirely, but it had become something quieter, more fragile. Still, they got up each morning. They worked. They attended meetings. They listened. They watched one another. And they followed the rules, even when they didn't understand them, even when they didn't believe in them, even when they were afraid, especially when they were afraid. As the days passed and the radios continued to hum with static and sermon, one question lingered in the minds of many residents. What would happen if the outside world finally came knocking? Chapter 8. Letters from the Jungle. It is a curious thing how words travel from the thick heat of the Guyanese jungle, far away from highways and payphones. The people of Jonestown still managed to reach back across the ocean to America through ink and paper. Letters became lifelines, pages filled with looping cursive, scribbled margins, and cautious optimism. Others were heavy with anxiety, carefully constructed to be read by two audiences, the loved ones back home and Jim Jones himself. Welcome, dear listener, to another chapter in the strange and suffocating history of Jonestown. Before we go deeper, may I ask, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you wish to follow the slow unraveling of this haunting story by the late 1970s. Jonestown was no longer an idea or an experiment. It was a functioning settlement with fields of cassava and bananas, rows of wooden huts, a medical outpost, a schoolhouse, and a watchtower. But it was also a place of profound control. Jim Jones, increasingly paranoid and deteriorating in health, saw betrayal in every shadow. People's Temple members were instructed on what to say and what not to say. Letters were written under supervision. Some were dictated. Some never made it out. Yet still, they tried to communicate. Some letters, often from children or teenagers, described Jonestown as paradise. They wrote of fruits they had never tasted before: soursop, mango, guava. They told stories about feeding pigs, working in the communal kitchen, learning about socialism. They praised the community spirit, the absence of racism, and the vision of a better world. These letters often ended with carefully repeated slogans like, "We love Father, He protects us." Others hinted at weariness. One woman, writing to her sister in San Francisco, said, "We work very hard here, but that is the price of freedom. I miss music. There is music here, but not the kind that moves you in the same way." Another wrote, simply, "I'm safe. I hope you are too. Please, keep writing. Your letters mean everything." Not all were permitted to be honest. Temple members knew their words might be read aloud at public meetings. A single wrong sentence could mean punishment, social isolation, hard labor, or worse. Some practiced the art of subtle suggestion, embedding truth between the lines of praise. A boy of 17 wrote to his former schoolmate, "It rains every day. The trees are so tall, you almost forget the sky is still up there. It's a good place to think." That was all. But in Jonestown, where speaking freely could be a dangerous act, even poetry became rebellion. A few families back in California and Indiana sensed something was wrong. They noticed the absence of questions in the letters they received. They noticed a sameness to the tone, unlike their loved ones' usual voices. Some received form letters with phrases that seemed copied from each other. They began to write back with concern. But many of their letters were never delivered. Mail was filtered, sorted, and sometimes burned. The People's Temple tried to maintain the illusion that Jonestown was thriving. They published newsletters with cheerful photos and success stories: students learning, doctors treating patients, crops being harvested. But privately, those inside the jungle compound were becoming exhausted. Medical supplies were limited. Food was not always plentiful. The humidity worsened Jones's health, and the letters that slipped through the cracks began to tell a different story, one of doubt, of discomfort, of longing for something left behind. Jones responded with more rules. He feared infiltration. He worried about defectors. He began staging loyalty tests. He taught the community how to survive without America, how to live and die for their beliefs. Letters that had once been filled with curiosity began to sound more desperate. Some asked for simple things: music tapes, photographs. Others pleaded for visits or promised they would explain everything later. One woman ended her letter like this: "We believe in what we're doing, but sometimes the nights are too quiet. If you don't hear from me, just remember that I tried." It is difficult to know how many of those letters ever reached their destination. Some remain in FBI files, yellowed, and fragile. Others were found scattered in the ruins of Jonestown after November 18th, stamped but unsent, words caught in the pause between one world and another. The letters from Jonestown were not loud. They didn't shout rebellion or demand rescue, but they were full of longing. They asked to be remembered. They tried to tell the truth as best they could. And now, decades later, they remain quiet witnesses to something that should have never happened. As you rest now, imagine holding one of those letters in your hands. Imagine the weight of a message written under surveillance, the soft press of someone's worry between each word, and ask yourself, if you had received one, what would you have done? Chapter 9. Government Attention. In the silence of remote South America, thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., Jonestown might have remained a footnote, a strange commune in a strange land, self-sustaining, self-contained, but the United States government, always listening, always watching, eventually turned its eyes toward the jungle, not because of headlines at first, and not because of the ideology, but because of something quieter, more persistent. Families back home. They were the ones who wouldn't stop calling, you see. By the late 1970s, concerned relatives of Jonestown residents were beginning to organize. They had written letters to embassies, left voicemails with journalists, stood outside federal buildings holding photographs of their sons, daughters, cousins, grandchildren. Many of these concerned parties formed what became known as the Concerned Relatives Group, an informal coalition of families who suspected something dark was happening beneath the surface of Jim Jones's utopia. They had no evidence of violence, only silence. Some hadn't heard from loved ones in months. Others received robotic-sounding letters, void of personality, almost certainly written under duress. In some cases, people believed their family members were being held against their will. But the challenge was jurisdiction. Jonestown was in Guyana, an independent nation. The FBI couldn't just walk in. The CIA had no legal authority. And so the American government moved slowly, hesitantly, until a congressman got involved. His name was Leo Ryan, a Democrat from California, outspoken, curious, unafraid of stepping into conflict zones. Ryan had a history of unconventional investigative methods. He once had himself briefly jailed to study prison conditions. When his constituents began contacting him about Jonestown, he listened. He listened a little more carefully than most. The complaints weren't just whispers. Some were affidavits, sworn testimonies from former temple members. They described long work hours, armed guards, public humiliation rituals. They told of people being denied passports, of children separated from their parents, of growing paranoia and punishment. Ryan took the claims seriously. At the same time, the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, had started to keep informal tabs on Jonestown. Consular officers had visited the settlement, usually with temple escorts, and noted the conditions. On the surface, Jonestown seemed orderly, clean. People appeared happy, if tired. But officials were always kept to a tight schedule. Interviews were monitored. No one could speak freely. And as more reports trickled in, so too did pressure on the embassy to do something more. Behind the scenes, the State Department debated how far it could or should go. Jonestown, after all, was populated by American citizens. But they had voluntarily expatriated. Many had legally immigrated to Guyana. Jim Jones had taken steps to make the temple look legitimate on paper. There were charters, permits, even tax forms. Technically, nothing was being done illegally. But technically, something was very wrong. By mid-1978, Leo Ryan had decided to go in person. He would fly to Guyana, enter Jonestown himself, and investigate. Officially, it was framed as a mission. Unofficially, it was a rescue operation. If people wanted to leave, he would help them. Journalists from NBC and other major networks agreed to come along. Members of the Concerned Relatives group joined to cameras would roll. Microphones would be hidden. The world was about to see the jungle compound up close. This was not welcome. News in Jonestown. Jim Jones was informed of the congressional interest by his contacts in the United States. He began preparing the settlement. He warned residents that agents of imperialism were coming, that Leo Ryan was part of a plot to destroy their sanctuary, that spies and defectors had betrayed the cause. There were rehearsals, more drills, more speeches. He called them white nights, nights when the community would gather and be tested for loyalty. Sometimes this meant drinking a red liquid that was, for the time being, not poison. Sometimes it meant staying up all night while Jones shouted about enemies. These rehearsals grew darker and more frequent as Ryan's visit drew near. Meanwhile, in Washington, nobody was sure what would happen. Some worried that Ryan's visit might provoke conflict. Others hoped it would lead to peaceful solutions. But few imagined what actually awaited them in the jungle. Letters had raised the alarm. Government officials had responded with caution. And now, finally, a congressman was stepping into the unknown. It's a strange point in the story. A pause before the plunge. The moment when the eyes of the world turned toward a place that had worked so hard to remain hidden. There are still questions in this part of the tale, questions about how much the government knew and when, about how systems fail when paperwork looks clean but souls are suffering, about what it means to be free when you're surrounded by walls that are invisible but absolute. As you drift now into sleep, let yourself picture the quiet halls of an embassy, the steady tapping of typewriter keys, the slow assembling of reports no one wants to file. And then imagine the jungle still quiet, still green, holding its breath, because soon someone was coming and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 10. Congressman Ryan. It began, as many things did, in Washington, with a stack of letters. For months, Congressman Leo Ryan's office had been receiving thick envelope-stiped pages, handwritten notes, photocopied articles, worried pleas. They came from parents, siblings, former temple members. Their message was consistent, insistent. Something was wrong in Jonestown. They said their children weren't allowed to come home, that letters had stopped arriving, that the phone lines were silent, that people wanted to leave but couldn't, that Jim Jones was no longer just a preacher. He was a warden, a ruler, a man no one could question. Ryan was not known for ignoring concerns. Representing California's 11th district, he had a reputation for showing upon the ground in the middle of things. In the 1970s, he had once gone undercover into Folsom Prison to investigate inmate conditions. He didn't shy away from complicated matters, and the story of Jonestown intrigued him. It sounded too strange to be true, too grave to dismiss. The government had no clear position. The State Department had received complaints, but their officials reported back that residents in Jonestown said they were fine. Jim Jones had invited them to visit. They had visited, and nothing, on the surface, had seemed amiss. But Ryan, hearing a different story from the families back home, decided to go see for himself. It was an odd trip from the start. Ryan arrived in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, in mid-November 1978. With him were a handful of staffers, several journalists, and members of the Concerned Relatives group. There was tension before they ever left the airport. Guyanese officials were hesitant, nervous about involvement. The People's Temple, through its lawyers, pushed back against the visit. They said the group would not be welcomed in Jonestown, that there were logistical issues, that no one was being held against their will, and no foreign congressman had any business causing trouble. For 2 days, the group waited in Georgetown. They met with U.S. Embassy staff, tried to arrange transportation, fielded more letters. Meanwhile, Jim Jones sent messages back to the jungle. He was increasingly paranoid, reportedly anxious and angry, pacing between loudspeakers and meetings, warning his followers that their sanctuary was under threat. He called it an invasion. He framed it as proof of a worldwide conspiracy, racism, the CIA, back in the Capitol. Congressman Ryan remained patient. Finally, permission was granted. A small delegation would fly to Port Katuma, the airstrip near Jonestown. They would be allowed to tour the settlement. It was a strange arrangement, a visit to an alleged utopia, carefully managed, quietly resisted. The plane to Port Katuma was small, noisy, and low-flying, skimming over dense jungle canopies. Beneath them lay hundreds of square miles of green, broken only by winding rivers and the occasional glint of a tin roof. Jonestown, from above, did not look unusual. A collection of low buildings, corrugated rooftops, vegetable plots, and dirt paths. It looked like a modest farm. It was, in fact, a jungle compound. At the edge of the airstrip, temple members met them with guarded smiles. A few pickup trucks arrived to transport the visitors. Congressman Ryan rode in the back, squinting into the sun, notepad in hand. The jungle was thick around them, hot, humid, buzzing with insects. The road was rough. When the delegation arrived at Jonestown, they were greeted with music and rehearsed cheer. Children waved. A sign read, "Welcome Congressman Ryan." There was laughter, bright shirts, handshakes. Jones was waiting. Jim Jones looked different than the pictures most people had seen. He was bloated, wearing sunglasses, his voice strained, but he still commanded attention. He gave a speech welcoming the group, praising Guyana, emphasizing the safety and happiness of his people. Temple members lined the pavilion, smiling, clapping, echoing every line. It was part theater, part ritual, part uneasy truth. Ryan took notes. He asked questions. So did the reporters. At first, everything appeared fine. Residents described their lives positively. They showed off crops, schools, dormitories. They spoke of community, purpose, freedom from racism and poverty. But some whispered when no one was looking. Some slipped notes into reporters' hands. Some looked down when asked if they wanted to stay. That night, a communal dinner was served. Jones gave another speech, defiant, tinged with resentment. He talked about the outside world's lies, the unfairness of the media. Congressman Ryan listened carefully. The next morning, a quiet shift took place. Several temple members approached the visitors. They asked to leave. They said they weren't safe. One man, Vernon Gosney, secretly handed a note to NBC correspondent Don Harris. It read, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." Others began to come forward, Tutim and Grace Stone's son, John, among them. It was becoming clear to Ryan that everything was not as it seemed. People wanted to go home. Not all, but enough. And they were scared. Ryan assured them that they could leave. The United States government would protect its citizens. He told Jones the same. And for a moment, it looked like the matter might resolve peacefully. A small group would return to Georgetown. The rest would stay. Everyone would move on. But the atmosphere in Jonestown grew heavier. Jones looked more agitated. Some temple members began watching the delegation more closely. Tension rose. On the morning of November 18th, as Ryan prepared to leave, a temple member tried to attack him with a knife. The man was subdued, but the moment shifted everything. Ryan, shaken, knew it was time to go. That afternoon, the group, those from the original delegation and about 15 defectors, headed back to the airstrip at Port Katuma. They loaded into trucks again, this time with nervous glances behind them. At the airstrip, as they prepared to board 2 planes, a tractor with a trailer pulled up. Inside were several armed temple guards. They opened fire. Congressman Leo Ryan was killed instantly. So were 3 journalists and 1 temple defector. Several others were injured. The survivors fled into the jungle, back in Jonestown. Word of the shooting reached Jim Jones. What followed was swift, horrifying, and beyond comprehension. But that part comes next. For now, in the quiet of the Guyanese afternoon, the jungle heard the echoes of gunfire. A congressman had come to investigate a troubling story. He had come to protect American citizens. He died doing so on foreign soil, in a place that had called itself a paradise. Chapter 11. The Final Visit. It was a quiet Friday morning in Jonestown, Guyana. The air was thick and slow-moving, heavy with the smell of red soil, moist leaves, and boiled rice. The sun filtered through palm fronds and canvas rooftops. And on that morning, November 17th, 1978, outsiders walked freely among the people of Jonestown for the first and last time. Congressman Leo Ryan stood in the middle of the settlement, sleeves rolled up, notebook in hand, eyes watchful. He spoke in low tones to temple members who approached him cautiously. Some were hesitant, some were curious, and some leaned in close, as if the jungle itself had ears. The visit had not gone according to Jim Jones's plans. He had agreed reluctantly to allow the delegation in after days of negotiation, delays, and shifting excuses. They had arrived. The congressman, a few staffers, several journalists, and relatives of Jonestown residents, all bearing questions and quiet suspicion. It was to be a public relations formality, maybe even a show of goodwill. But from the first step onto the dirt path, it became something else. By midday, the press had begun to film. Smiling children posed beside banana trees. Elderly residents walked reporters through the clinic, the kitchen, and the schoolroom. A choir sang softly under a palm-thatched pavilion. Jonestown was, for a few hours, a model commune. Jones himself appeared later, dark glasses covering tired eyes, his voice flatter than usual. He spoke in long, wandering monologues about persecution, peace, socialism, and survival. He made jokes, he shook hands, but his eyes scanned every corner, every conversation. That night, a reception was held in the pavilion. Lanterns were hung. and people danced. Punch was served. Music played. The delegation smiled politely. The residents clapped in rhythm. Congressman Ryan gave a short speech expressing gratitude and mild admiration. If the visit had ended then, it might have gone down in history as a strange but peaceful inspection. But in the flickering shadows, something else had already begun. It started with a note during the reception. A temple member slipped a piece of paper into the hand of one of the reporters. It read, simply, "Help us get out." The message rippled. Like a silent alarm, a second note came, then a third. Whispers grew louder. People stepped behind trees to speak in low, hurried tones. By the following morning, November 18th, at least 15 temple members had expressed a desire to leave with the congressman. A growing list of names was being drawn up, and Jim Jones knew it. He had not slept well. He rarely did anymore. His health was declining. His mind, once sharp and persuasive, now moved in loops. He paced under the shelter of his cabin, sweating, muttering. The thought of defections of betrayal gnawed at his spine. To Jones, this was not merely disobedience, it was disintegration. The act of leaving Jonestown was not just leaving a place, it was leaving the movement, the family, the struggle. And worse, it invited the enemy in. In his world, there was no middle ground, only loyalty or treason. As the group prepared to depart later that morning, tension clung to the air like fog. People cried, some shouted, a few ran back and forth across the settlement, unsure of what to do. A tractor and trailer were prepared to transport the defectors and delegation to the Port Kaituma airstrip. Jones called an emergency meeting in the pavilion. His voice, through the loudspeakers, cracked with intensity. He asked why they were leaving, what had gone wrong, what had the revolution done to fail them. Some stood up and said they wanted to go home. Others said nothing, as the congressman and his group began loading up to leave. A knife appeared in the hands of a man named Don Sly, a longtime temple member. He lunged at Ryan quickly, clumsily, but others restrained him. Ryan brushed it off, insisting he was fine. The delegation pushed forward, eager to reach the airstrip. Jones watched from the shadows, and he made his decision back at the pavilion. As the trailers rolled away, Jones called the community together. He picked up a microphone and began to speak calmly, slowly. He explained that the congressman's plane would crash, that enemies were closing in, that the time had come. A few hundred feet away, inside the tractor trailer, a boy clutched his mother's hand. A teenage girl held her breath. A temple member driving the vehicle glanced nervously at the road ahead. No one yet knew that the final curtain was drawing close. The group would make it to the airstrip, but only some would ever leave. Guyana, call to action, soft and sleep-friendly. This was the last moment of sunlight before darkness fell over Jonestown. If this slow, somber journey into history has helped you rest tonight, consider following our channel for more sleepy explorations into forgotten pasts, quiet stories, gentle voices, and long walks through history, all here for you whenever you need them. Close your eyes now. The jungle is quieting again. Chapter 12. The Last Sermon. The final sermon did not begin with fanfare. There was no organ, no call to prayer, no quiet rustle of hymnals in a pew-lined church. Instead, it opened with the low hum of a generator in the background, the crackle of an old microphone, and the unmistakable voice of Jim Jones, tired, deliberate, known today as the death tape, is not a sermon in the traditional sense. It is not quite a speech either. It is a final monologue, a final performance, delivered to the people he had drawn into the jungle. People who had once believed he was a savior, or at least a prophet of something more just. On that day, November 18, 1978, the voice that had once inspired hope in the desperate now sounded exhausted, angry, and resigned. But it was calm, almost to calm. Lay down your life with dignity. As the tape begins, Jones is addressing the community, not from a pulpit, but from the central pavilion, the open-sided heart of Jonestown. Outside, it is late afternoon. The jungle holds its breath. Earlier that day, Congressman Ryan had been murdered on the Port Kachama airstrip. As word reached Jones, he knew that Jonestown could not remain hidden any longer. The U.S. government would come. The press would come. And so would punishment. And so he gathered his people, the community, men, women, children, and the elderly, filed into the pavilion quietly. They sat on benches beneath the corrugated tin roof. Many were confused. Some were weeping. A few had run into the jungle, only to be coaxed or forced back by armed guards. Jones took the microphone and began to speak. This is a revolutionary suicide. His voice, as it plays on the tape, is slow and gravelly. Not the booming preacher's voice of his younger days in Indiana or California. This was the voice of a man who had become both a prisoner and a warden of his own creation. He framed it as a political act. He told them they were not dying in vain, that their death would send a message, that they were surrounded, that their children would be tortured, their elders imprisoned, their cause destroyed. None of this was true, but by then, truth had become flexible. What mattered was control. What mattered was the moment Jones spoke of the People's Temple's enemies. He reminded the crowd of the lies told by outsiders. He repeated again and again, "We are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act." In the background, children cried. Others tried to comfort them. A woman's voice pleads with Jones, "Can't we wait?" Jones replies with chilling finality, "Death is a million times preferable to 10 more days of this life." The vats earlier that day, barrels were prepared containing a mix of flavor aid, cyanide, Valium, chloral hydrate, and Phenergan. A table was set up in the pavilion. Children were brought first. It is said that nurses from the community helped administer the poison. Some parents fed it to their children with their own hands. Others tried not to. A few reportedly resisted and were forced to comply. Those who disobeyed were watched by the security team, known within Jonestown as the Red Brigade, who carried guns and crossbows. As each child died, their parents followed. Some went quietly, lying on the ground beside their family. Some screamed, wept, resisted, the air filled with the scent of chemicals and fear. Bodies began to line the pavilion floor, soft and silent. Jones kept speaking, even as people collapsed, even as the weeping turned to silence. Jones continued. His voice lost volume, but not rhythm. He called it peace. He called it courage. He called it an act of solidarity. And then he sat down. When his turn came, he did not drink the mixture. He died of a single gunshot wound to the head. Whether it was self-inflicted or administered by someone else remains unclear. The tape ends in silence. Today, that tape is kept in the archives of the FBI. It has been transcribed analyzed, and debated. It has been used in documentaries, trials, and classrooms. But hearing it, really hearing it, is something different. It does not feel like history. It feels like a quiet unraveling outside the jungle. The world moved on. In the days that followed, Guyanese soldiers would arrive. What they found was a silent village. Hundreds of bodies, many clutching each other, lying beside barrels, benches, and empty cups. There were more than 900 dead. Among them were 276 children. The last sermon had ended in the most final way possible, not with a blessing, but with the closing of a chapter in human history that many still struggle to understand. Sleep, thought. Sometimes history whispers instead of shouting. Sometimes it ends not with answers, but with silence. The last sermon of Jonestown wasn't about faith. It was about control and the cost of giving it away. Chapter 13, November 18th. The sun rose over the jungle slowly, filtering through layers of humid mist. November 18th, 1978, began like most days in Jonestown, with rustling leaves, the low hum of insects, and the voice of Jim Jones over the camp loudspeakers. His tone was subdued that morning, raspy and tired. He urged the community to gather strength, to resist, to stay alert. Many brushed it off as another of his warnings, another sermon delivered too early and too often. But that day would not be ordinary. It was a Saturday. And though the children played as usual and the kitchens began preparing meals, the undercurrent of tension was palpable. The events of the previous day, the visit of Congressman Ryan, the defection of several members, and the uncertain outcome of their departure had left Jonestown uneasy. The sky was gray by noon, and thunder rumbled softly in the distance, as if echoing the dread that had begun to settle across the settlement. Call to action if this story has kept you listening with a quiet chill in your spine, and you'd like to follow the rest of this slow, haunting descent into history. Make sure to subscribe to Boring, Sleepy History. There's more to come, from what happened next in the jungle to the long, strange ripples that stretched into the future. For now, let your breaths settle. Let your thoughts drift gently as we walk slowly through the last hours of Jonestown. Radio tower crackled to life in the early afternoon. In Georgetown, officials were receiving word that Congressman Ryan had been attacked. But in Jonestown, no outside news came in. Jim Jones had gathered his inner circle in the pavilion. Tape recorders were placed on a wooden table. A large vat was brought in, one of the same types used earlier for fruit drinks. But this one was filled with something different. A message was broadcast, one that would later become infamous. Calmly, Jones began speaking to the assembled residents, his voice captured on tape for what would be his final sermon. He spoke of revolutionary suicide. He said the enemy would soon arrive and that death was preferable to surrender. His words were not screamed or shouted, but delivered like a lullaby, coaxing, soothing. Deadly. People began to gather, slowly at first. Some whispered, some cried, some obeyed in eerie silence. Parents were told to bring their children forward first. The liquid in the vat, laced with cyanide, Valium, chloral hydrate, and flavor aid, was administered using large syringes and paper cups. The children went first, and then the adults. The pavilion filled with sounds, not of chaos, but of murmurs, tears, and the distant crying of infants. Jim Jones' voice continued over the loudspeakers, encouraging the act. "Don't be afraid to die," he said. "Death is just stepping over into another plane." At the nearby airstrip, Congressman Ryan and 4 others lay dead. Back in Jonestown, a horrifying calm had descended. Over 900 people, including over 300 children, lay in rows, in a scene that would shock the world just hours later. By dusk, the jungle was silent again. Jim Jones was found dead on the stage of the pavilion, a gunshot wound to the head. Around him, hundreds of bodies lay motionless, many of them holding hands or with arms around one another. There were no animals, no birdsong. Even the insects seemed quiet. By the time authorities arrived at the settlement the next day, the magnitude of what had happened was almost incomprehensible. The smell of death hung thick in the humid air. Journalists and rescue workers wept openly. They walked among the bodies, documenting, identifying, and trying to understand. Many of those who died that day had written letters. Some pleaded for forgiveness. Some explained their reasons. Others simply said goodbye. Scattered among the homes and communal buildings were books, radios, toys, and tools. A life interrupted. Back in the United States, news of the tragedy spread quickly. For many, the word Jonestown became synonymous, not with a place, but with something else. Entirely with cults, with control, with blind faith, and with loss. The images that emerged were seared into the public consciousness. Piles of bodies, arms intertwined in a clearing carved out of the jungle. And yet, among all the horror, there were still survivors. People who had been away from the settlement, or who had run into the forest when the final ritual began. Their stories would come later. But for the world watching from afar, November 18th, 1978 was a singular day, one of sorrow, one of confusion, and one of unimaginable death. 900 people died in Jonestown that day. It remains the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the events of September 11th, 2001. And in the middle of the jungle, where vines slowly began to reclaim the land, Jonestown was left to rot an eerie silence over the place that once echoed with sermons, singing, and the voices of children. A silence that still lingers. Chapter 14. Aftermath. It took hours for word to travel from the jungle clearing of Jonestown to the outside world. The Guyanese authorities had received a radio message, short and unsteady, speaking of something terrible that had happened. But few could have imagined the full scale of it. When police officers and soldiers arrived, they found a silence that was not natural. It was not the silence of night or rest. It was the silence of finality. The camp was still. Hundreds of bodies lay sprawled across the open ground, shoulder to shoulder, lined up in arcs around the pavilion like the petals of some morbid flower. There were so many that the human eye could not take them in all at once. Most were face down. Some clutched one another. A few had fallen with arms stretched outward, as if reaching toward something they could no longer grasp. The investigators stopped talking. They simply walked. Among the dead were women, children, the elderly, and young men. Some wore Sunday dresses, others khaki uniforms. And everywhere was the lingering scent of artificial grape flavor. The cyanide mixture they had swallowed had been stirred into tubs of Flavor Aid, a detail that would soon become grimly iconic. The soldiers radioed back to Georgetown. They would need help, a lot of it. The recovery process began slowly, under the sweltering sun and the ever-thickening jungle air. American officials were summoned. A U.S. military team was flown in. The Guyanese government, shocked and unprepared, turned over control of the scene to the Americans, who treated it like a war zone. Helicopters began arriving from nearby bases, and soldiers in hazmat suits walked through the camp, carefully counting, photographing, and identifying the dead. The smell worsened. The bodies had been lying in the heat for days, and decomposition was rapid. Insects buzzed incessantly. Reporters who managed to reach the site later described it as surreal. A quiet, tropical colony turned into an open-air morgue. Some tried to count the victims. The initial figure released was 400, but investigators quickly realized they had been mistaken. The bodies were so tightly packed, with children hidden beneath adults, that many had been missed. The number rose steadily to 600, then 800. Eventually, the final count settled at 918, including more than 300 children. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. Back in the United States, the news hit like a hammer. The headlines were blunt and horrifying. 900 dead in jungle suicide. Massacre at Jonestown. The death of a cult. Televisions showed grainy footage of the compound, the tubs of poison, the abandoned shoes, the dead pets, and the empty cabins. For many, it was their first real exposure to the words Jonestown or People's Temple. Families across the country waited desperately for news. Lists of names were slowly published. Calls flooded government hotlines. Some families learned the fate of their loved ones from the evening news. Others never received a formal notification at all. The U.S. military began the grim task of returning the bodies, because Guyana lacked the facilities to embalm so many corpses, and because decomposition was far advanced. Officials decided to fly the remains to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where mortuary teams could begin the slow work of identification and preparation for burial. Many were never claimed. Some families did not want to be associated with the scandal. Others could not afford burial. Hundreds were interred in mass graves. The largest was at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, not far from the original People's Temple headquarters. It was quiet and unmarked for years. Later, a simple granite memorial would be erected, listing all 918 names, including that of Jim Jones, which sparked decades of controversy. In Washington, the investigations began almost immediately. The House Foreign Affairs Committee opened hearings. There were questions. How had this happened? Why hadn't anyone intervened earlier? Were there signs? Should the U.S. have done more? The State Department was criticized for ignoring or minimizing earlier warnings. Former Temple members testified. Survivors were called to speak. So were journalists and embassy staff. Many broke down in tears while recounting what they had seen or heard. Some senators, themselves visibly shaken, admitted that the system had failed, but deeper. More uncomfortable questions lingered in the public discourse. What makes people follow someone like Jim Jones? What would drive hundreds of people to die at his command? Was it brainwashing? Was it coercion? Was it faith or fear? Sociologists and psychologists were summoned to television panels. Documentaries were rushed into production. The term cult entered mainstream vocabulary with renewed force. People whispered the word in church pews, school cafeterias, and office lunchrooms. Parents looked at their children differently. Communities eyed new religious groups with suspicion. And in California, many former temple members who had not moved to Guyana faced harassment and public shaming. In Guyana itself, life attempted to return to normal. The jungle began its slow, steady reclamation of Jonestown. Without maintenance, the buildings fell into decay. Vines crept through doorways. Animals returned. The paths were overtaken by roots and silence. The Guyanese government officially closed the site. The area was later sold to private hands. Occasionally, curiosity seekers or journalists would make their way in. Some took photographs. A few took soil samples. Most simply walked through the remnants, trying to understand what had happened in that clearing. There were plans, at times, to build a school there, or a community farm. None ever truly materialized. In the years following Jonestown, the People's Temple as an organization ceased to exist. Its remaining properties were sold off. Lawsuits were filed by families of the victims. A few temple leaders who had remained in the U.S. were charged with financial crimes or obstruction. Some fled, some cooperated. Most disappeared into private life, hoping to forget. Those who had escaped Jonestown with their lives, the few who had walked out, or hidden, or refused to drink, lived with memories that rarely left them. Survivors described recurring dreams, intrusive flashbacks, guilt. Many struggled to find work or housing, burdened by the public association with what had happened. One woman, who had lost 3 children at Jonestown, would later speak in schools about cult awareness. Another spent years visiting grave sites anonymously. Some never spoke publicly at all. Over time, the word Jonestown became shorthand for tragedy, for manipulation, for the dangers of blind devotion. But for many, it also became a lesson in listening to the signs, to the early warnings, to the soft voices that had tried to raise alarm. The site remains mostly untouched today. The jungle, indifferent and immense, covers what remains. But the story is not forgotten. The silence of Jonestown still echoes, and in that silence, history sleeps heavy, tangled, unresolved. Chapter 15. The FBI Files. It began with the noise of paper. Boxes stacked neatly inside a quiet Washington storage facility, labeled in black marker, People's Temple, Jonestown. They waited in the cool dimness of government archives, where silence had replaced the shouting of sermons and the drone of jungle insects. After November 1978, the responsibility of documenting what had happened in Jonestown no longer belonged to the church or the press. It became the task of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI, under its Domestic Security Division, had quietly launched an extensive case file following the deaths in Guyana. Operation Rhexity for the broader Cold War-era contingency system was one of many bureaucratic mechanisms that had made room for such a tragedy in its vast folders. But Jonestown didn't fit easily into any category. It wasn't a foreign threat, nor a traditional cult, nor an isolated crime. It was an accumulation of contradictions. The files grew heavy with uncertainty. Thousands of pages were eventually collected, examined, and filed. They included personal letters recovered from the site, audio recordings, church rosters, witness statements, and financial documents Some materials had been flown out from Guyana under armed guard. Others came through interviews with survivors and former members. A single cassette tape, labeled Q042, would become one of the most haunting entries in the entire archive. Among the earliest findings was a detailed timeline of the group's relocation from California to Guyana. The FBI attempted to trace each wire transfer, each plane ticket, and each land purchase made by the People's Temple. Agents noted that Jones had been meticulous with money, even as his sermons denounced capitalism. Nearly every member had signed over their Social Security, pensions, or savings accounts. The financial trail was chillingly efficient. The recovered journals, however, were messier. Handwritten notes from residents showed the stress and contradictions of life in Jonestown. One notebook contained repeated copies of the same sentence, written like a punishment: "I will never question the movement." Another, written in neater script, recorded gardening schedules and meal plans. The banality and the fanaticism were side by side, written with the same pen. Audio recordings formed the most disturbing part of the collection. The final tape, now widely known as the death tape, was recorded during the mass poisoning. On November 18th, the FBI enhanced the audio to better analyze the voices. There were pleas from children, steady encouragement from Jones, and interjections from adult followers urging calm. Forensic audio specialists tried to identify each voice. Some tapes also included rehearsals of previous white nights, drills for revolutionary suicide, showing that the final event had been rehearsed, emotionally and logistically. In addition to tapes from Guyana, the FBI also analyzed surveillance materials from California. Well before the mass suicide, informants had already flagged Jones's increasing paranoia. The Bureau had opened a subversive organization file in the early 1970s, but had made no move to intervene. After the fact, the internal memos were filled with frustration, not just about the missed warning signs, but also about the jurisdictional limits that had kept U.S. agencies from acting decisively overseas. As the investigation grew, agents were assigned to interview survivors and relatives. These debriefings were delicate. Many survivors were still in shock, confused by what had happened, and grieving family members who hadn't returned. Some were defensive, others were numb. The Bureau tried to determine how such a large group of people had consented or been coerced into dying together. There was no single answer. One survivor told agents she had believed it was just another drill. She said Jones had staged several mock suicides in the past, only to reveal they were loyalty tests. Another said she had been in a different part of the compound when the announcement came and chose to run into the jungle instead. Still another, a man who had joined the temple in San Francisco, admitted he had suspected something was wrong for months but hadn't known how to leave without being followed. FBI psychologists were brought in to create profiles. They explored the psychological mechanisms of groupthink, obedience, and mass hysteria. Reports noted how isolation, overwork, food scarcity, and sleep deprivation had worn down individual willpower. The profiles suggested that Jonestown wasn't just a failure of politics or ideology. It was a case study in the fragility of human autonomy under social pressure. There were also files about the children, names, ages, causes of death. In total, over 300 minors had died in Jonestown. the FBI's Child Victim Identification Program processed dental records, photos, and reports from grieving relatives to confirm identities. Many had no birth certificates. Some had never left the commune after arriving in Guyana. Their lives and deaths existed almost entirely within that isolated world as the legal case developed. The FBI coordinated with the U.S. State Department and Guyanese authorities to identify the perpetrators of violence, if any remained. A few temple members had not been in Jonestown at the time of the deaths. One of them, Larry Layton, was tried for his role in the murder of Congressman Ryan at the Port Kaituma airstrip. Layton's trial, based largely on testimony and FBI evidence, would stretch on for years. He would eventually become the only member of the People's Temple convicted in U.S. courts for actions related to Jonestown. In the meantime, the Freedom of Information Act ensured that some of the materials would eventually become public. Journalists and researchers submitted requests. In the decades that followed, portions of the FBI's Jonestown files were declassified. They revealed a mix of the chilling, the mundane, and the bewildering. Some pages were heavily redacted. Others were copied dozens of times. Ink faded into soft gray, as though trying to disappear. One report detailed a list of Red Brigade members, Jones's most loyal inner circle, who had enforced order during the final hours. Another recounted a strange detail. Jones's body had been found with a gunshot wound to the head. Unlike the poison used by most others, it suggested that someone else may have pulled the trigger. A short FBI memo, dated December 1978, simply asked who gave the final order. Years passed, but the files remained. Students, academics, journalists, and even screenwriters combed through the documents, trying to understand how it had all come to this. In FBI file rooms, folders titled People's Temple, Guyana continued to sit quietly. Most were rarely touched, except during anniversaries or when new FOIA requests came through. The physical weight of the tragedy had been boxed, numbered, and placed on shelves. The Bureau's final assessment was cautious. The files concluded that Jonestown was a convergence of political disillusionment, spiritual manipulation, and emotional dependency. It was not the work of a single madman, nor of evil followers, but rather a group whose collective hope had slowly collapsed into despair. Some agents who worked the case later admitted they had trouble sleeping during the investigation, one wrote. In a personal note, never filed officially, that the thing he remembered most wasn't the photos or the tapes, but the sheer number of lunchboxes and children's shoes laid out on the jungle floor. The silence of that place, he wrote, was louder than any crime scene I've ever seen. Chapter 16, The Survivors. Tone.com, immersive and sleep-friendly. In the early hours of November 19, 1978, a few people wandered the jungle paths near Jonestown with no clear direction, only the ache of confusion and the sounds of the forest around them. These were the survivors, the few who had managed to escape the event that had silenced nearly everyone else. Some had slipped away in the chaos. Others had never been there at all, assigned elsewhere by accident or luck. But for each, survival was not just a physical state hit, became a burden that would follow them for decades. Some were children, led by older siblings into the bush when whispers of the final act began to spread. Others were adults who had long doubted Jim Jones and used the noise and confusion of Congressman Ryan's visit as a chance to vanish. One woman fled with her baby in the cover of dusk. A teenage boy hid under a building for hours. A group of seniors who had been too frail to attend the pavilion meeting simply remained in their cabins. By dawn, they emerged into a silence unlike any other. There were around 80 people who lived out of more than 900. Some were in Georgetown, some were in Port Kaitama, a few were in Jonestown itself, having narrowly avoided death by absence or misdirection. They became reluctant storytellers, witnesses to a world that few could comprehend. If you're still listening, feel free to follow the rest of this quiet journey through memory and loss. You can subscribe to Boring Sleepy History for the full story, all told slowly, softly, and thoughtfully, just like this. In Georgetown, the shock came in fragments. Survivors at the People's Temple headquarters heard static-filled radio messages, caught pieces of what had happened, and then silence. Some couldn't believe it. Others already knew, in that way, that the body sometimes senses truth before the mind agrees. Among them was Deborah Layton, who had defected months earlier and had tried to warn the world. Now her warnings had become real, and she watched the headlines fill with what she had feared all along. For many of the survivors, returning home was complicated. America welcomed them with suspicion, media frenzy, and occasional hostility. They were followed by reporters, labeled as cult members, and often forced to answer the same questions over and over again. Why didn't you leave? Didn't you know? How could you let this happen? But these questions rarely scratched the surface. Many had left everything behind: families, homes, communities, to follow what they believed was a mission of hope and racial unity. They hadn't joined a death cult, they had joined a church. The descent into paranoia and control had been gradual, subtle, and for many, invisible, until it was far too late. Some survivors simply refused to speak. They changed their names, moved across the country, or disappeared into quiet lives. Others, like Tim Carter and Stephen Jones, Jim Jones's own son, spent years trying to understand, to explain, to forgive, and to educate. They became part of documentaries, panels, interviews, trying to make sure people knew Jonestown was not a cartoon, not a meme, not a single bad man. It was a slow unraveling of trust, community, and the human need to belong. In the forests around Jonestown, the vines grew thick again. Buildings collapsed under the weight of rain and time. The pavilion rotted. The slogans faded. What had been a commune of ambition and promise became an abandoned relic. But the survivors carried Jonestown with them. For some, every November brought it back. For others, the memories crept into dreams, into silence, into the mundane. A ringing phone, a certain song, the smell of the tropics in Summer Survivor. Laura Johnston Cole later wrote, "We were trying to change the world. We believed we could." She went on to become a teacher, an activist, and a quiet keeper of history. Her story, like so many others, didn't end in Guyana. And now, with eyes half closed and heart heavy with history, drift off to sleep. There are more chapters ahead, soft voices from a place few remember properly. Let's continue this quiet journey tomorrow. Chapter 17, Jonestown's Legacy. There are some events in history that leave no monuments, only questions. Jonestown is one of them. It lingers not in stone statues or grand museums, but in footnotes, media fragments, and the uneasy quiet that follows a tragedy too complex to retell simply in the years after 1978. As news cycles moved on and jungle paths grew over, the legacy of Jonestown began to take shape not as a single story, but as a cloud of overlapping memories, moral debates, and cultural echoes. What did it mean? How did it happen? Could it happen again? These questions floated through universities, churches, think pieces, and classrooms. Scholars studied the speeches of Jim Jones, the social structure of the temple, the psychology of cult dynamics. But often, even they admitted there were no simple answers. Let the stillness of the past settle gently around you. The deeper we go, the quieter it gets. This is a slow telling, meant not to alarm, but to gently uncover what lies beneath forgotten headlines. In the American imagination, Jonestown became a metaphor before it was even understood. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" emerged from the tragedies casually in offices and conversations, often by people who didn't know where it came from. But behind the phrase was a moment of desperation, control, and loss. It wasn't about blind faith. It was about exhausted people, many of them poor and marginalized, who saw no other way out. Some tried to rewrite the narrative. Conspiracy theories appeared, some wild, others quietly persistent. Was Jonestown a political experiment gone wrong? Did shadowy forces play a role? But most historians settled on something both simpler and more disturbing, that this was a community that spiraled out of control under the weight of one man's paranoia, the world's indifference. Survivors, scholars, and writers worked hard to restore dignity to those who died. Memorials were eventually placed, including one at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, where many of the unidentified victims were buried. The plaque listed all the names, even Jim Jones, controversially but intentionally, to tell the whole story. Jim Jones's legacy became a cautionary tale, but the People's Temple itself was harder to pin down. Before Jonestown, it had fed the poor, desegregated spaces, housed the homeless, and offered a rare kind of racial equality. What does it mean when something good becomes something terrible? How do we hold both truths? Sociologists began studying Jonestown alongside other closed religious movements, comparing it to Waco, Heaven's Gate, the Branch Davidians. They analyzed control techniques, isolation, sleep deprivation, repetition, punishment, surveillance. They also studied why people stayed, because they believed, because they hoped, because they were tired, because there was no one left to trust outside. Jonestown became part of college syllabi. Documentaries aired, books were written, like Deborah Layton's Seductive Poison and Tim Reiterman's Raven. Each account added texture to what had become a caricature in public memory. Over time, these stories softened the myth, reminding readers that the victims were not fools, not faceless bodies, but people, parents, teachers, musicians, carpenters, children. If you're feeling drowsy, that's all right. This is a long, slow walk through the fog of memory. You're not meant to solve it, just to sit with it, gently, without judgment. In Guyana, the site of Jonestown faded. For a while, there was talk of turning it into a museum or a memorial site, but the jungle had its own ideas. Buildings collapsed, pathways vanished, and the dense green swallowed what remained. Only the occasional researcher or filmmaker made the trip. For most, Jonestown remained unreachable, not just physically, but emotionally. The Guyanese government rarely spoke of it, and locals mostly left the site undisturbed. There was no tourism, no gift shop, no plaques, just silence and trees. In the U.S., however, the legacy lived on in subtle ways. Government agencies reevaluated how they monitored. Religious groups, crisis hotlines became more aware of communal psychological manipulation. Journalists questioned how they covered fringe movements, whether they fueled the fire or ignored the warning signs. But perhaps the deepest legacy was personal. Survivors, families of the dead, and former temple members spent decades sorting through grief, guilt, and memory. Some found peace, some never did. The name Jonestown remains heavy. It is whispered in late-night documentaries, analyzed in psychology lectures, and occasionally mocked in pop culture. But underneath all that noise is a quiet truth. It was a human story, filled with flawed people, good intentions, bad leadership, and irreversible choices. And yet, in remembering it slowly, softly, and fully, we do a small service to those who were lost. We let them be more than a headline. We let them rest. Close your eyes now. The forest is quiet again. The voices have faded. The dust has settled. Sleep, and if you dream, let it be of light rain over leaves, not loud headlines, just stillness. Chapter 18. What remains in the years after Jonestown faded from headlines, and the clearing in the jungle was slowly reclaimed by vines. What remained was not the buildings, or the bodies, or even the tape sit, was the persistent ache of what might have been. There are no tour buses to Jonestown, no guided paths or plaques. The site was left untouched for decades, guarded unofficially by the forest. In the early 1980s, Guyana's government made no plans to preserve the location. The buildings collapsed, grass overtook the walkways, animals returned. Only a few scattered objects, metal bed frames, broken radios, bits of clothing remained, slowly rusting beneath the canopy. Visitors who ventured there in later years, mostly journalists or surviving family members, described an eerie stillness. No human voices, just the sound of insects and wind. Nature did not remember the screams. It simply went on. If your eyes are growing heavy now, that's perfectly fine. This is a place of quiet reflection, a moment to breathe in the past and exhale into rest. In the United States, what remained was harder to see. It lived in sealed government documents, in the recollections of reporters who arrived too late, in the boxes of cassette tapes filled with Jim Jones's final sermons, still studied by scholars and students of cult behavior. Jonestown remained in archives folders of FBI photos, transcriptions of radio messages, aerial shots taken from helicopters as bodies were counted, not named. But there were also more intimate remains. In Oakland, California, where many members of the People's Temple had lived. Families built small memorials in homes, framed photos, faded letters, letters from loved ones written just before the end, describing life in Jonestown as both hopeful and strained, ordinary and strange. One mother kept her daughter's last letter in a drawer beside her bed. "Mom," it said, "don't worry. We're making something beautiful here. We work hard, but I believe in what we're doing." It was dated just days before November 18, 1978. in cemeteries across the U.S. Gravestones bear the names of the Jonestown dead, some funded by surviving relatives, others by strangers. One site, the Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, became the resting place for more than 400 unclaimed bodies. For decades, they lay in unmarked graves. Then, in 2011, a new memorial was installed. Black granite slabs etched with the names of every person who died, including Jim Jones. This inclusion stirred controversy. Some argued that he should not be remembered alongside the victims. Others insisted history must be recorded in full, even when it is uncomfortable. People came to the memorial in silence. Some wept, some brought flowers, some only stood there, unsure what to feel, because what remained wasn't just death, it was confusion, grief, shame, and, for some, guilt. For many years, survivors carried an invisible weight. Why did they live? Could they have done more? Why didn't anyone stop it? Let your thoughts drift now, like leaves floating on a still lake. There are no answers in this part of history, only echoes. In documentaries and books, Jonestown remained as a lessons, though the lessons varied. Some focused on the danger of cults, others on the vulnerability of people seeking hope. Still others examined how charismatic leaders exploit fear and isolation. For sociologists and psychologists, Jonestown became a case study. For artists and writers, it became a metaphor. But for many, Jonestown was just a family story. A cousin who joined a church in San Francisco, a sister who moved to Guyana for a better life, a grandmother who sold everything she had to follow a dream of equality. They were not nameless. They had birthdays, favorite songs, pet peeves. One survivor later said they were not brainwashed, they were hopeful, and they trusted the wrong man. And then there were the sounds that remained. Recordings of the final sermon, known as the death tape, stored in archives, analyzed in court, studied in classrooms. The voice of Jim Jones, broken and drugged. The murmurs of the crowd, the cries of dissent, the haunting silence after the last voice fades. Few can listen to it for long, but it remains not for shock value, but as a record, proof that this happened, proof that people believed in something so deeply they followed it into darkness. And yet, in some ways, what remained most of all was the question, could it happen again? That question is not for tonight. Tonight is for silence and sleep and gentle memories of people whose names were nearly forgotten. You are safe here. The past is quiet now. Let's return tomorrow for Chapter 19, Memory and Myth. Chapter 19, Memory and Myth. It is quiet now, where once there was chaos. The jungle around Jonestown has reclaimed most of the land. Roots creep through what remains of the foundation. The signs are gone, the slogans faded, the voices silenced. Yet Jonestown lives in memories, in myths, in the uneasy cultural corners where tragedy becomes story. Memory, as it ages, becomes less about what happened and more about how we remember it. In the days and weeks after November 18, 1978, the word Jonestown carried with it a clear image, rows and rows of bodies, brightly colored cups, and a name, Jim Jones, darkened by violence. But as the decades passed, that clarity blurred. Films, novels, radio stories, and grainy documentaries filtered the event through many lenses. Each told the story slightly differently, choosing what to emphasize, what to question. What to Leave Out by the mid-1980s. The name Jonestown was often used as shorthand for blind obedience. College professors invoked it in lectures about authority. Parents mentioned it in cautionary tones when talking to their children about manipulative leaders. News anchors referenced it when reporting on other groups deemed cults. The reality, with all its nuance and complexity, was often left behind in the rush to simplify. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the cultural lexicon, though it wasn't actually Kool-Aid, but a cheaper knockoff called Flavor Aid that had been mixed with cyanide. That didn't matter to the myth. The phrase became a joke in corporate boardrooms, a warning in political debates, a punchline in TV sitcoms. Few who used it paused to consider the horror behind the words. The media's role in shaping Jonestown's memory was both immense and incomplete. Immediately after the tragedy, television networks aired dramatic reports, sometimes looping the same footage again and again. Helicopter shots of the bodies, audio of Jim Jones' final speech, shaky video of Congressman Ryan's visit. Newspapers ran long investigative pieces, some compassionate, some sensational, but very few took the time to explore why people had followed Jones in the first place. Fewer still examined the systemic failures that allowed such a community to be built in isolation. As years went by, historians and scholars tried to fill the gaps. They gathered interviews with survivors. They studied people's temple records, FBI files, and the thousands of letters Jones had written and received. They listened carefully to the final tape, a chilling 44-minute recording made during the last moments in Jonestown. It captured Jones speaking in a strange monotone, urging his followers toward revolutionary suicide, while voices in the background wept, protested, and finally fell silent. It was a terrible artifact, but it told part of the story. Myths, though, resist correction. Some people claimed that Jonestown had been a government experiment, a test in mind control. Others suggested that Jones had been assassinated, that the deaths were not voluntary. These theories, however outlandish, clung to the public imagination. In some corners of the internet, they still do. Meanwhile, survivors built quieter narratives. Some spoke publicly, often with caution and sorrow. Others kept their stories close, unwilling to expose themselves to misunderstanding or judgment. They remembered Jonestown not as a headline or a metaphor, but as a place where they had lived, worked, and believed. A place where they had lost loved ones. A place that had promised hope and ended in ruin. Each year, small groups gather to remember. In cemeteries where the unclaimed dead were buried. At private homes. In modest ceremonies marked by poems, prayers, or just silence. They say names, tell stories, hold photographs. They remind themselves and each other that the people who died were not symbols. They were not Kool-Aid drinkers. They were sons and daughters, parents and partners, people who wanted a better world and followed a man who said he could provide it. The myth of Jonestown is tidy. The memory is not. Some remember Jim Jones as a monster. Others remember him as a man who lost himself. Still others remember him as both. Survivors recall the good he did in the early years, disintegrating churches, feeding the hungry, sheltering the poor. But they also recall how, over time, the goodness gave way to paranoia and control. They remember being watched, being silenced, being scared. They remember that leaving was not as simple as it seemed, and they remember the ones who tried to leave and what happened to them in time. Jonestown became a case study in sociology and psychology. Books were written, classes taught. It was analyzed as an example of groupthink, of manipulation, of the dangers of isolation. But even the best analyses sometimes missed the deeply personal reasons why people had stayed. The longing for family, the belief in equality, the fear of what would happen if they left. Memory fades, but it does not disappear. In Guyana, there is little to mark the site now. Tourists do not flock there. There are no museums, no gift shops, just jungle, thick and quiet. In America, memorials are sparse. A simple stone in Oakland bears the names of those who died. Some names are missing, some are contested. The stone is often the only physical marker people visit. But for those who remember Jonestown, no marker is needed. The memory lives in them. Over the years, some have tried to reclaim the narrative, not to erase the tragedy, but to deepen the understanding. Documentaries have focused on survivors. Podcasts have aired audio recordings and conducted interviews. Plays and novels have attempted to humanize the community, to show that the people of Jonestown were not mindless followers, but individuals, each with their own reasons for joining and their own struggles with leaving. Still, for many, the myth remains stronger than the memory. It is easier to remember Jonestown as a horror story than to reckon with what it tells us about human vulnerability, about leadership, about longing. Easier to speak of mass suicide than to ask what might have prevented it. Easier to label the victims than to listen to them. But history is not meant to be easy, and memory, when handled gently, can be a kind of justice. Final chapter. Why they stayed. In the quiet hours after tragedy, questions tend to linger longer than answers. Among the most persistent in the wake of Jonestown is also the simplest. Why did they stay? It's easy to imagine that everyone who followed Jim Jones to Guyana was blindly devoted, or perhaps too afraid to leave. And yes, fear and control were part of the structure, but the truth was far less monolithic. Jonestown was not merely a compound. It was a quilt stitched together from hundreds of lives, with each thread carrying its own reasons, its own quiet justifications. They stayed not because of one reason, but because of many, and those reasons, like all human decisions, are layered, conflicting, and often invisible from the outside. Many stayed because they believed. For some, the People's Temple was the first place they had ever felt seen, the first place they had been told, sincerely and repeatedly, that they mattered. Jim Jones spoke to the forgotten, the working poor, the elderly, the racial minorities who had long since stopped expecting fairness from the world. He offered them not just equality in theory, but equality in structure roles, purpose, responsibility. Many people felt not manipulated but honored. Jonestown was their reward for years of struggle. A promised land with no landlords, no racism, no hunger. They stayed because they wanted the dream to work. Others stayed because of the jungle. By the time they had arrived in Guyana, most temple members had already severed many ties with their former lives. They had sold homes, left jobs, moved across the country or the world. In Jonestown, passports were surrendered, letters were censored, and leaving required not just intention, but means. The jungle was not symbolic. It was real, thick, and miles deep. The nearest outpost, Port Kaima, was days away by foot, and even if they got there, they'd still be in a foreign country, alone, with no money. They stayed because the jungle hemmed them in, soft and green and absolute. Some stayed because of each other. In Jonestown, the boundaries between family and community were blurred. Children were often raised collectively. Meals were eaten communally. Daily work was shared. Bonds grew quickly, tightly. For many, this was their family, now the only one that hadn't given up on them. Leaving Jonestown often meant leaving loved ones behind, and in many cases, family. Members didn't all agree on what was true or false about Jones. Parents wanted to go. Their children didn't. A son wanted to leave. His mother believed too deeply. They stayed because someone they loved still believed, and many stayed because leaving meant betrayal. Jones had built an elaborate system of loyalty against them. Insiders against outsiders. Truth against lies. He positioned himself not as a leader, but as the last line of defense between the People's Temple and a world full of hate. He warned them of plots, invasions, CIA interference, and persecution. He spoke often of martyrs, and painted every defection as treason, every question as a risk to the entire project. The longer someone stayed, the harder it became to separate doubts from disloyalty. They stayed because walking away felt like pulling a brick from the bottom of a fragile wall. There were also those who stayed because they were tired. Life in Jonestown was physically demanding and emotionally draining. The days were long, hot, and filled with labor. Sleep was short. Meetings were endless. Food was basic. Punishments for even small mistakes were harsh. Under constant surveillance and emotional pressure, the energy required to plan and escape, even think clearly, was in short supply. When you live in crisis long enough, it becomes normal. Resistance takes imagination, and that, too, had withered. They stayed because it was easier than figuring out how to leave. Finally, some stayed because they had run out of time. By the final days, the internal systems of control were so tight that even whispers of dissent were dangerous. Guards monitored the perimeter. Informants reported on conversations. Loudspeakers droned day and night, replacing thought with repetition. The small, safe window to leave had closed slowly until it no longer existed. By the time Leo Ryan stepped into Jonestown, the final act had already been rehearsed. It was, in many ways, too late. They stayed because there was no longer any real choice. So why did they stay? Because of belief, because of fear, because of exhaustion, because of love, because of hope, because of habit, because of the jungle, because of one another, because of Jim Jones, because of themselves, because of the system, because of the dream. Most of all, they stayed for reasons that made perfect sense to them in the moment. The real tragedy of Jonestown isn't just how it ended, it's how many reasons people had to believe it wouldn't.